I will rag on Apple any day for their business practices, but if you care at all about ARM, the M1 Mac is a seriously impressive machine. It's not just an ARM CPU. We've had plenty of laptops that have had ARM CPUs in them before. The special thing about the M1 is it's actually powerful enough to get some real work done on it. Now, obviously, it's not the most powerful CPU out there, and it does have some problems being an ARM CPU. But in the applications that it's good for, it is by no means a slow processor. So I'm not the only one who thinks this. Linus Torvalds actually was considering buying one, but he has some concerns over it. Obviously, being Linus Torvalds, he wants to run Linux on it, but he has some concerns about whether that's going to be possible. I won't be reading any specific articles. I'll be compiling from a few different ones, so I'll leave all of my sources down below if you want to check them out for yourself. So all of this started when someone on a forum called Real World Tech asked Linus Torvalds a very simple question. The question was, what do you think of the new Apple laptop? And Linus Torvalds responded by saying, I'd absolutely love to have one if it just ran Linux. I have fairly fond memories of the 11-inch MacBook Air, the mid-2011 model. So that would be this one right here. And honestly, this was a great device. I had a MacBook Pro from around the same era, and honestly, I have nothing negative to say about the older MacBooks. They have a nice keyboard, the screen was not great, but everything else was perfectly fine. And it wasn't really that difficult to actually get Linux running on those devices, so if you wanted to, you could always go and do so. But as time went on, as Linus says right here, Apple had moved on to make Linux less convenient. You can still run Linux on the newer MacBooks. I don't think anyone's got it working on the newest version yet, but the previous model, you can get it working on there. It's just, you have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it's a pain, and you might as well just go buy another computer, because it's going to be much, much easier to actually do. So Apple may run Linux in their cloud like every other company does, but their laptops don't. I've been waiting for an ARM laptop that can run Linux for a long time. The new Air would be almost perfect, except for the OS, and I don't have the time to tinker with it, or the inclination to fight companies that don't want to help. Now, you might be thinking, okay, let's assume the M1 Mac ran Linux absolutely flawlessly, so you just get a USB device, stick an ISO on it, plug it into the device, it just magically works. Even so, why would Linus actually want an ARM laptop, or just an ARM device in general? The reason why, he actually clarified in a discussion he had with Dirk Hondel. So for 10 years or so, I'd been complaining about the fact that it's really, really hard to find ARM hardware that is usable for development. So the Linux kernel can be used on ARM. The Linux kernel is what the base of Android is, and if you want to work on something like that, you actually need ARM hardware to actually develop it on. So they exist, but they've certainly not really been real competition for x86 so far. So you can go and get things like, say, I don't know, the Pinebook Pro. The Pinebook Pro is by no means a bad device. The problem is it's not really suitable for doing something at the level of kernel development. Maybe you can do some light programming on it, maybe you can do some pretty heavy programming on it, but developing something like a kernel is a completely different scale of development. Or you could get something like, say, a Raspberry Pi. A Raspberry Pi, once again, is a really, really cool device and is really powerful for what it is, but it's still just not something you can really do kernel development on. Or you could use any smartphone you have, and once again, smartphones are very powerful. In fact, some smartphones are more powerful than you'll get with something like the Pinebook Pro, but it still just isn't the sort of thing that is suitable for kernel development. There is an order of magnitude different level of performance you need to reasonably do kernel development. Now, I know someone's probably going to say, oh, but you could do kernel development on something like a Pinebook Pro, and yes, you could do it. But what about when it comes to compiling it? And this is where it becomes a serious issue. If you can't compile it, then you can't test it. And if you can't test it, what are you even doing? And yeah, you could compile it. It might take a week. It might take 2 weeks. And Linus is a very busy man. He wants it to be done in a reasonable amount of time because he has other things he needs to be doing. And it doesn't have to be the fastest CPU out there. But something like the M1 Mac is by far the most powerful ARM CPU he could be using on a consumer device like this. So in an interview with ZDNet, Linus actually clarified why he thinks it's going to be an issue to run Linux on it. So what he said was, the main problem with the M1 for me is the GPU and the devices around it, because that's likely what would hold me off using it, because it wouldn't have any Linux support unless Apple opens up. The problem with Apple is they like to make a lot of their own things. And when you make a lot of your own things, that means you're the only one who has driver support for them. And if you're the only one who has driver support for them, good luck getting anything else actually working on it. Now, I'm pretty sure someone's managed to get Linux virtualized on one of these M1 Macs. I know someone's managed to do it with Windows, so I don't see any reason why Linux would be impossible. The problem, though, is running something virtualized and running it on bare metal is a very, very different problem where you actually have to deal with the driver support directly. And that driver support probably isn't going to come anytime soon, but if you have an M1 Mac and you do want to run Linux on it, this doesn't mean that all hope is lost, because someone actually is working on a project to do this. So here's this article from Apple Insider. Basically, this person started up a new Patreon project and wants to bring Linux to the M1 Mac, but the person who's actually working on it isn't just some random person who's just never worked on porting Linux like this, because they were involved in getting the Nintendo Wii, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4 all running Linux. So the goal of the Patreon, according to the developer, is to massage Linux on M1 Macs to the point where it's not merely a tech demo, but is actually an OS that you'd want to use as a daily driver. So if you want to go and support the Patreon, I'll leave a link to it down below, and have a read through it before you go and do so, and see if it's something you feel like supporting. Now, even with this project here, it's not going to happen anytime soon, and it might not happen until maybe the next generation of M1 Macs for you to actually get proper support. Now, an interesting thing about the M1 Macs is they do fit Linus's very minimal wish list for what he wants a computer to actually be. So, he doesn't really care about the battery life. It's not going to be running on the battery anyway, because even though it has a 20-hour battery life, when you compile a kernel, you're not getting 20 hours of battery life. That's just not going to happen. It'll probably be more like 5, maybe 8, if you're lucky. So, it'll be plugged into the wall basically all the time. It is nice to have, and maybe I would use if I had one myself. Now, as for the cores, because it has that really long battery life, it did have to sacrifice some performance, so he would prefer the individual cores to be more powerful, but maybe when the M1X comes out, he'll think about the desktop version instead of the laptop. Now, as for the RAM, 16 gigs is enough for what he's doing, but he recognizes that if you're someone who needs to use a lot of VMs at the same time, then more RAM is going to be good. On his desktop system, he does have 64 gigs of RAM, but that's also because he has 32 cores. I don't think those actually correlate, but that was actually his reason for having 64 gigs of RAM. But he does recognize that 32 gigs probably would be sufficient for his workload, but he can get 64 gigs of RAM, so you might as well get 64 gigs of RAM. As we established earlier, it's by no means a new thing for Linus to actually want these powerful ARM-based CPUs. But the reason why he wants them is he wants to actually shift the way that ARM development is being done. Because it's not like you can't already do ARM development for a kernel. But he doesn't like the way that you have to do it. So right now, most ARM development is done in the cloud. But cloud development is not preferred, he said, at least not by kernel development. Basically, he wants to develop for ARM, but not just develop for it. He wants to actually use it in his day-to-day workload so he can actually live in ARM and basically fully understand it to his best extent. Now, I can't speak for a kernel developer, but what I can say is that whenever I do any Windows development, I wouldn't want to do that on Linux. Whenever I do any Apple development, I wouldn't want to do that on Windows. If you want to fully understand the system you're developing for and you want to have the best support possible, you want to live and breathe that system. Now, not everyone is going to be like that. Some people want to have the hacky way to do it and do it the way they want it to work, but for the people it makes sense to, it really does make sense. Now, one thing that does amuse me about all of this is how much Linus likes ARM and how much he hates Nvidia, and now Nvidia is acquiring ARM. I don't know how his opinion is going to change on ARM in the coming years, but it's going to be something you want to pay attention to. So, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say today, but before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So, a special thank you to Chris, Joachim, Donald, Corbinian, Andre, Nathan, Montazar, Will, Chico Bento, Joseph Mitchell, Pitty, Tony, Tushar, and all of my $2 patrons. If you want to go on some of my working links down below to my Subscribestar, LibrePay, Patreon, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and then this channel is available on Odyssey, Library, and BitChute if you want to watch on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.